much at home here in the company of hunters and storytellers, because the two seem to go together. Jerry, who was before me on the dais, is an example of just what I'm saying. The first of my family who was a hunter and a storyteller was my grandfather, Courtney Smith. And I remember him as a man with a beard like Father Christmas, sitting on the stoop of his little cottage. Behind him on the wall were the heads of the buffalo and the lions he shot, and on the floor were the zebra and the leopard skins. And sitting on the leopard skins were myself and my little cousins listening to his stories. And those stories were fantastic. We knew most of them by heart, and we used to call for them and correct him on the details. One that stands out in my memory is the deadly bicycle wheel snake. Now, the bicycle wheel snake lives on top of mountains, and its diet is little boys of 6 or 7 years of age. And there is no way you can run away from a bicycle wheel snake, because he puts his tail in his mouth and stiffens up into the shape of a bicycle wheel, and he rolls down that hill so fast you'll never get away from him. So my childhood dreams and nightmares were haunted by the bicycle wheel snake. The other nefarious animal in Grandpa's lexicon was the Kommetjie-Gat snake, Kommetjie-Gat cat. Now, this nefarious creature was about the size of a civet, but under its tail, it looked like a piece of sirloin steak. And this Kommetjie-Gat at night used to come up to the chicken coop and back up against the wire. And the chickens would pick the steak. And he'd just clap his tail down like that. And the chicken couldn't squawk, couldn't do anything, and he just let it off into the bush. But the best of all Grandpa's stories was the wolfhound. And the wolfhound's name was Brainless. And Grandpa in his early days had been a transport rider from Delagoa Bay up to the Witwatersrand before the railway line came in. So his job was to buy an ox wagon, transport all the stores up through what is now the Kruger Park and the Lowveld up to the mines. And whilst he was preparing for a trip at Delagoa Bay, he won Brainless in a poker game. And before they'd gone a week out of Delagoa Bay on the road with the wagons, he regretted it, because Brainless lived up to his name. He chased the oxen, he bit the drivers, he stole the food out of the larder, and by the time they reached Whiskey Drift, Grandpa had just about enough of Brainless. And Whiskey Drift was halfway between Delagoa Bay and Johannesburg, and there was a little hut there that the transport riders used to overnight in as a change from sleeping under the wagon. And this particular night, Grandpa got into the hut at Whiskey Drift and put Brainless out on the little veranda. But in the middle of the night, Brainless started his tricks again. He started making a terrible racket out there, and barking and growling and carrying on. So Grandpa had it up to the neck. So he reached out and he picked up his sjambok, which you all know is a whip made of hippo hide. And he picked this up and walked to the door, opened the door, and he saw Brainless there in the moonlight, and he started to wail at him with the whip. But after about 3 shots, Brainless made a noise he'd never made before. So Grandpa struck a match and held it up. And what had happened was, a black-maned lion had come onto the veranda, eaten Brainless, and Grandpa was beating the black-maned lion with a sjambok. Well, so Grandpa shot back into the hut and slammed the door. And he was panting with fear and relief, having escaped from the lion, and suddenly he felt the whip start to twitch in his hand. So he struck another match and looked down, and you'll never believe it, he had a black mamba by the head. So he'd been beating the lion with a black mamba. Next of our family to become a hunter and a storyteller was Charlie. And Charlie became a real professional hunter back in the days when that was a very rare animal, and he hunted down in Mozambique, Malawi, and all that area of East Africa. But Charlie had one vice: he liked his whiskey. So a lot of his clients also liked their whiskey, and his favorite client was a belted earl from England who came out every year to hunt with Charlie. And on this particular trip, they were going down the Rift Valley with all the porters carrying their packs on their heads, and one of the porters slipped and fell. And he had the most precious cargo in the whole caravan, the case of whiskey, and every single bottle broke. Now, the Earl and Uncle Charlie went into shock because they were 100 miles from Arusha, the nearest town and the nearest source of whiskey. But Uncle Charlie, always being a man of integrity and intrepid, clear thinking, said to the Earl, "Don't panic. I've got a couple of really fast runners here, and we'll send them into Arusha. We'll have the whiskey with us within a day or two." So he wrote a letter to the shopkeeper in Arusha: "Kindly supply bearer with 1 case of Johnny Walker whiskey." And they sent him off. And the runner disappeared overside with his little message and a forked stick. And the Earl said to him, "How long is this going to take?" And Charlie said, with his hand shaking, "About 3 days." And on the morning of the 3rd day, they put a spotter up in the tallest tree, and they put the table out under the mahogany tree, a white cloth on it, 2 crystal glasses and a pitcher of water, and waited. And sure enough, there was a cry from the top of the tree, "He's coming, Elaboya, Elaboya." And so into the camp staggered the runner, dusty to the knees, still carrying the fork stick with the message in it, handed it to Charlie, and the storekeeper in Arusha turned the note over, and written on the back of it, "Sorry, no Johnny Walker, will White Horse do?" And one of Uncle Charlie's other escapades was that he had an Italian count, who we shall call Guido. And Guido came out on the first and only safari he ever did with Uncle Charlie. And he turned out to be the most dreadful shot that Charlie had ever had guided in his life. He had a 1075 with a set trigger. And you know, these set triggers, you pull the back trigger and it then sets the front trigger at about a quarter of a pound pull. So it can go off at any time. And Charlie got him up against a big buffalo bull. Close, very close. And he said to Guido, "Calm down, take a good rest, just go for his shoulder." Guido set his trigger, took careful aim, closed both eyes, and pulled it. And he hit the buffalo fair square in the center, equidistant between the front legs and the back legs. So the buffalo took off into the Kasakasaka. And Charlie said to Guido, "Well, that wasn't the best shot I've ever seen, but now you go back to the truck and I'll finish the job from here." So Guido said, "No, it is my buffalo. I was killed my buffalo." And they argued for a while, and in the end Charlie gave up, put him in front, Charlie walking behind the 2 trackers, and They went into the Kasakasaka, they'd gone 100 yards, and here come the buffalo. All scabby with dried mud, nose up, those mean little eyes glinting, horns spread, and suddenly Guido lost all interest in the proceedings. And he decided he'd go back to the truck. He did this by throwing his 1075 into the bush and running back over the top of Charlie, which took Charlie by surprise. Charlie went down on his hands and knees, lost his rifle, and Guido was gone. But at this stage, he was picturing Charlie was reaching for his rifle with his bottom in the air, and the buffalo hooked him. And the point went in through his breeches, right dead center in the crack. And the buffalo picked him up on its head and carried him and measured 150 yards, shaking its head, with Charlie like a cocktail onion on a toothpick. Finally, the buffalo threw Charlie into the top of a thorn tree, and his bearers came and got him down from the tree, and they got him back to Salisbury Hospital. When my father heard of this, he went to see his brother Charlie, and then Charlie described the whole incident to him. Charlie at this stage had about 200 stitches in his rear end, and at the end of the whole description of the hunt, my father said to him, "Charlie, what were you thinking at that moment when you were on the end of the buffalo's horn?" And Charlie's reply was, "Charles, I said to myself, Charles Courtney Smith, this time you have made a complete asshole of yourself." My father became a guardian of the wildlife in a sort of roundabout fashion, because he, in 1932, the year before I was born, he studied the game laws, and the game laws said that any resident could go to any police station in the territory and take out a license for 3 elephant at a cost of £5 each. And if you read it carefully, it said you could go to any police station and for each of them take out a 3 elephant license. So my father got on the train at the Belgian-Congo border and went down to the Victoria Falls, stopping at all stations in between and taking out elephant licenses. So he ended up with 15 elephant licenses. He went into the Zambezi Valley and had himself a 3-month shoot. He came out with 200 pounders and a lot of other big elephant bulls, and of course got arrested immediately. He conducted his own defense, the charge being poaching, the maximum fine being £100. So within the first half hour of the case, it became obvious that he was in the right. He could have the license were legally his. So he got cocky. Age of 23, got cocky. So he shook his finger under the judge's nose and said, "There's something ruddy fishing going on in this course." So the judge fined him £100 for contempt of court and released him. And the wildlife authority was so impressed with this display and the way he conducted himself, they made him an honorary warden. And after that, he was a guardian of the law rather than a poacher. I came along shortly after that. And as Grace said, I was born into the perfect setting for a young boy who was interested in wildlife and in hunting. I was given my first rifle at the age of 7, which is a 2.2 long rifle, pump action by Browning. And I wish my friend Lofty and myself we went out and we shot everything. We shot guinea fowl on the wing. We shot duiker and reed-buck and impala. And then, when I was 14 years of age, my father left me in sole charge of the ranch whilst he went off on a business trip. The first night he was gone, the boys came up and said that the lions had killed one of Dad's prime Afrikaner bulls. So I took down his 9.3 by 57 from the rack, and I went out there, and with my two sidekicks, Axel and Spanner, two young African friends. The three of us went out and we walked up to the kill, and there were 3 lions on it. And, you know, they say that children make the best soldiers because they're absolutely fearless, no brains at all, no imagination. And I just walked up, and the first lioness came straight at me and I shot it. Second one did the same, I shot it. The lion tried to get away and I shot him. So I had 3 lions down, 3 shots in about 60 seconds. And my father came back from his business trip, and he was so impressed with what I had done that he first of all ripped the strip off me about a yard wide. And then he made me into a professional hunter, because it was then my job to pay 5 pounds a year to provide all the staff on the farm with meat. So Axel and Spanner and I, given an old truck, a couple of packets of ammunition, we went off and we camped overnight, and we shot buffalo, we shot lechwe, and we bring them back, usually 3 days later, smelling to high heaven, green. But then, of course, as a lot of you know, the African people like their meat eyes. They like Englishmen with pheasant, you know. The better it stinks, the better it tastes. And I enjoyed being a professional hunter for the first year, and then I thought I would expand my activities and become, as well, a commercial fisherman. Now, I must just digress for a moment and tell you about Axel and Spanner. These 2 friends of mine were named by my father. It was the prerogative of the landowner in those days. When one of the workers had a child, they'd bring them up to the big house, and as a mark of respect to my father, ask him to name the child. And these 2 guys were twins, and they were brought up by their mother just at the time that my father was changing a half axle on the half shaft of the back axle of a truck. So my father, lacking poetic inspiration, looked around. The first 2 things he saw was the Spanner and Axel. So Spanner and Axel became my friends. My plan for the fishing venture was, I had watched my father blowing up termite hills in the lands with gelignite, and I studied carefully how he went about this, and during the ensuing weeks I stole first of all about 3 inches of fuse, and then a primer, a detonator, and 3 sticks of gelignite. These I made up into a bomb, and we went down to the Kafue River, where for 2 shillings I hired a dugout canoe, and Axel and Spanner were my accomplices. But Axel and Spanner had seen the effect of dynamite on a termite hill, and they were not very willing participants. So the 3 of us got into this canoe. We paddled out into the middle of one of the big pools in the Kafue River, which we knew from experience contained hundreds of big whiskered barbel. And I explained to them, now, guys, I'm going to light this, I'm going to drop it over the side. When I do that, paddle like furies. And I can, to this day, see those big dark eyes looking at me in horror as I lit the match to the fuse and dropped it over the side, and the bubbles started to come up from under the boat. Axel dropped his paddle over the side. Spanner did the same thing. So the 3 of us were paddling with hands to try and get away. But we were all paddling on wrong sides of the boat, so we were forming lazy circles over the burning dynamite, and then it went off. We all found ourselves about 15 foot in the air. We came down with dead barbel floating all around us, terrified crocodiles taking off river climbs. And that evening, when I went back to my father, with the head man of the village demanding compensation for his canoe, that was the end of my commercial fishing career. Little incidents and all the things that I'd seen over those years stuck in my memory and became the wellspring, the fountainhead for what was to follow. And when I was 29 years of age, I published my first book, which is called When the Lion Feeds. And I left Africa for the first time. I received a huge sum of £150 advance for the book, and before publication I had sold the film rights and the book club choice, so I was pretty well heeled, and I went to London to watch this whole magnificent, magical moment unfold before me. You know, I imagined all sorts of things that might happen. I might be invited to lunch at Buckingham Palace. I might even get a knighthood, you know. What really happened was not much. The books appeared in the bookstore window and stayed there. So after some time, discouraged, I decided to go back to Africa. I was in Heathrow Airport in the departures lounge, when I looked across the lounge, and I could hardly credit what I was seeing. There was a lady sitting in the corner reading When the Lion Feeds. You know, the hair on the back of my neck just stood up, and it was such an exciting moment, almost as exciting as shooting your first lion. So I watched her for a while, and hoped to see her smile, show some enthusiasm, perhaps a tear or two from, you know, the moving parts of my book that she was reading. And I sort of sidled up and had a look and saw what page she was at. And finally, I couldn't contain myself further. So I went up to her and I said, "Excuse me, madam, but that's my book that you are reading." She stood up. She put the book in my hands and said, "I'm terribly sorry, I just found it lying here." I've had a couple of other amusing experiences in aircraft and in aircraft lounges. One that I really enjoyed was more recently. And I was coming to the United States to go fishing in Alaska, just at the time that they were finishing the first proof of one of my books. So they were very anxious that I should read it as soon as possible, and they wanted to send it to me at the fishing lodge in Alaska, and I said, "That's not going to work." So what they did was they sent it to my publishers in America, in New York, and they would deliver it to me the moment I set foot in the city. So they gave me the proof copy of my book. I got on the Concorde to fly back to London, and I was reading my book in the Concorde. We'd been flying for about half an hour, and the chap sitting across the aisle from me leaned across and he said, "I see you reading Wilbur Smith's book." So I said, "Yes, I am." So he said, "Do you read many of his books?" I said, "I've never missed one." Read them all. So he said, "How do you rate him as a writer?" So I said, "Well, yes, Hemingway, perhaps. Rudyard Kipling." So my new friend said to me, I'm delighted to hear that, because Wilbur Smith happens to be a very good friend of mine. So I said, you kidding? No, he said, absolutely. He said, do you remember the character in When the Lion Feeds, Sean Courtney? I said, I'll never forget that character. Fantastic character. He said, based on my life. So I said, you know, I'm at a loss for words. So he said, I tell you what, give me your card. I'll have Wilbur Smith autograph a book for you and send it to you. I said, do you think he'd do that? He said, old Wilbur will do anything for me. So I gave him my card. He didn't even look at it. He put it in his top pocket. He says, you'll have from me. Surprisingly, I never did. For the last couple of days, I've been signing books in the exhibition hall, which has been a great pleasure. I've met so many lovely people there. But they don't always work so well, signing sessions. My first one in New York City was a Doubleday bookstore in Fifth Avenue. And I arrived in New York City, phoned from my very cheap hotel to the bookstore, and I said, I'm coming to sign books tomorrow. There was a sort of hesitation on the other side, and said, and what's your name? And I said, Wilbur Smith. And I said, hold on, and they heard papers rustling, and the lady on the other side, yeah, we've got you down on the list. And I said, how do I get into the bookstore? You know, I thought very least a stretch limo, and you know, possibly a red carpet out across the pavement. So she said, in New York City we do have taxis. So I took my own taxi to Doubledays. I walked in, and I know that many of you have been there. It's an enormous bookstore. And they just tellers all over the place, and I joined a queue of people going to pay for their books. When my turn came, the girl looked up and said, I said, I'm Wilbur Smith, and she said, well, where's your money? So I said, no, I've come to sign books. And she sighed wearily, you know, another one of those. She said, hold on, I'll look. She looked up a little, she said, you're on the second floor. And so I found my way up to the second floor. Sure enough, there was a table with about 150 books on it, 2 pens and a chair, and that was it. Nobody queuing up for books. So I sat down and I sharpened a pencil and I looked round, and after a while I saw a lady in the children's section, so I thought I'll flog her a book. And I sidled across and smiled at her winningly. She looked at me like I was some sort of New York pervy, and ran away. And then there was a fly, and I got to trying to kill the fly with a pencil. That didn't work very well. And then I looked at the far end of the floor where there was another author sitting at a table signing books. And he was signing books merrily. So I thought, that's very strange, because there was nobody there to pay for them or take them away. So I went across to him and I said to him, excuse me, Mr. Moore, why are you signing all those books? And he said, if you write in them, the bookstore can't send them back to the publisher. And you get paid your royalty. I tell you what, I shot back. I signed those 150 books, half an hour to spare. So then I had some time to kill, and I looked around, and there were a whole lot of Freddie Forsyth's books there. And I thought, Freddie's a nice guy. So I signed them all for him as well. And at the other signing session that was amusing was in Sydney, Australia. And there was a number of people waiting to have their book signed, and then a came the turn of this strapping Australian woman with a hard, sunburned face, and she put not one of my books, but Cain and Abel by Jeffrey Archer in front of me, and said, "It's for Bruce, my husband, on his birthday." And I said, "Madam, I'm not Jeffrey Archer." So she said, "Who are you then?" So I said, "I'm Wilbur Smith, Jeffrey Archer's next week." So I said, "Well, I'm not coming all the way back, you know, I've driven 100 miles, so you signed the damn thing, you see." So I wasn't about to argue with her. She looked like, you know, she hunted crocodiles as well. So I wrote in the book, "In the absence of Lord Archer," signed by Wilbur Smith. She picked it up and she said to me, "Doesn't matter who signs it. Old Bruce is not going to read it anyway." One of the other pleasures of writing is receiving letters from either satisfied or unsatisfied readers. And I read a book called Elephant Song. I like to think that I usually get my facts straight and my details consistent, but in this book, one of the characters has his hand and arm chewed off by a leopard. And 100 pages later, I've got him passing silver Marie Theresa dollars from one hand to the other. I received 600 letters from readers, and in the end, I just had a form letter printed, which said, "Congratulations, you've spotted the deliberate mistake. Your prize is a signed bookplate," and I sent that out to them. They kept them quite for a bit. And the other trick that I learned from Stuart Tootie, who was a veteran South African adventure writer, he told me what to do. Occasionally I got letters saying that I was racist and I didn't have my facts straight and they'd never read my book again, and why did I bother? I'd write back to them and say, "Dear sir, I think I should warn you that some bigoted, semi-literate oaf is writing letters to me, abusive letters, and signing your name to them." But the letters that give me the greatest pleasure are those that come from teachers or parents, you know, saying, "Little Johnny or Mary never read a book until we gave her or him one of your books for his or her birthday. And since then, they not only read your books, but they read every other book they can get their hands on." And if I do nothing else in my life but give the secret of reading for pleasure to a young person, it will have all been worthwhile for me. One of the most moving experiences I had was also in Australia when I was staying at the Hyatt in Sydney. I'd been there for 2 or 3 days and I was checking out. I was at the cashier's desk and I heard a young man say, "But I must see him, I must see him." And the reply from behind the front desk was, "Mr. Smith has already left." And I looked around and there was a young boy with one arm. So I went across to him and I said, do you want to see me? And he had a copy of The Leopard Hunts in Darkness. And in this book, the hero has lost a leg. And apparently this little boy had fallen off a train and had the wheel shear his arm off. And he'd almost given up on life. His parents were with me and they told me the story. And he wouldn't read, wouldn't go to school, wouldn't see anyone, locked himself in his room because of this loss he'd suffered. So they gave him a copy of Leopard Hunts in Darkness, and he read it, and like Craig in the book, realize that you can surmount any of those obstacles. And he came out, he was now playing water polo and fishing and doing all the things that a young guy could. And I want to tell you, I went. It really was that moving to know that I'd given that little guy something back again. And we still correspond from time to time, and he's doing well. We've said a lot here this evening, other speakers before me, and we all know in our heart of hearts that if we are going to preserve hunting, preserve the rare species that we hunt, and make sure that they will be there for our own children, we have to find, first of all, the money, and secondly, the land on which they can flourish. And this hunting has done this in the United States of America, in New Zealand, in Australia, and particularly at this stage in Southern Africa. Although there it is a bit of an uphill battle, as Bianca will tell you. But in order for that concept to move forward, we have to get the young people and those adults who are uncommitted and explain the ethos to it. It is no good wasting our time trying to convert the fanatics. You know, those people are lost. We must just go beyond them. For a case in point, I was at a debate recently, and I was saying, my point was, if we can harvest those animals, make them pay their way, they will be here for our children and our grandchildren. And the reply from the man opposite me was, I would prefer that the species goes extinct rather than you big bullies should kill them with your high-powered rifles. Now when you meet that sort of mentality, you know, you just have to walk away from it. Hunting is something that is in our genes and goes back from the time that our ancestors stood up on their back legs and walked out of the deserts of the Pleistocene and picked up with the opposed thumb the bone of a giraffe and used as a weapon. The fact that we were able to feed on high-protein meat gave us the leisure for other activities which made us what we are today, the dominant species in this world. Through all time, man's weapons have been very, very dear to him. He's lavished all his art on it, all his ingenuity, and right back from the slingers of Alexander, the longbowmen of Richard II, all those through the ages, weapons played a part of our life. Hunting has played a part of our life. And we would be very stupid to deny that fact. But when it comes to weapons, I, like everyone in this room, love rifles, I love firearms, I love tinkering with them. And some years ago, I conceived an absolute lust. I had a habit. I had to have a 416 Rigby made in the 30s, engraved on the long miles of action, big bore for big game. And they only made about 200 of those rifles. So I sent the word out. Word came back that a character called Rory Reader had one. So I phoned him and I said, Mr. Reader, I understand that you've got a 416 Rigby. He says, yes, but I don't want to sell it. I said, well, I don't want to buy it. So we started from there. And by the end of the week, I bought it from him, but he said to me, I must tell you that the buttstock is not original. It has been replaced by Rigby of London. I said, oh, well, you know, if it's replaced by Rigby, it's good enough for me. He said, but it's an interesting story. He said, I was hunting with Rupert van der Riet with this 460 in the Zambezi Valley, and he said, we'd been after this old bull elephant for days, walking him down, and finally we came through a dry riverbed. We came up the far bank, and Rupert was just in front of me. And at that stage, the bull elephant was waiting for us, not 30 yards away. Unprovoked charge, straight at us. Ears back, flapping, and it wasn't a mock charge. He said, so what I did is I just pushed Rupert out the way, and I took a frontal bane shot, boom, folded at the front legs, and the elephant slid into me, knocked me back, down the bank, and I fell on the rifle and broke the stock. So I said, you know, Rory, that's a fantastic story, and for me that only adds value, sentimental value to this rifle. So I thought, as other speakers have said before me, I'm proud to be a hunter, and I'm proud to be associated with the DSC and all the members here, and let's hope that we can keep hunting for ourselves and our children for many a long year to come. Thank you very much, ladies.
Yes, we'd like you to be associated with Dallas Safari Club, and on behalf of the members and all of our guests here, we'd like to present you with a life membership to our association. Thank you again.